Resuming debate, the honourable member for Saskatoon-Grasswood.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to speak to Motion 64, the Italian Heritage Month. So as Deputy Critic of the Canadian Heritage for our party, we certainly support this motion. The first Italian to land in Canada was the explorer, Giovanni Caboto. That was back in 1497. Wow. He is better known to us, though, as John Cabot. The first settlement of Italians in Canada did not occur, though, until 1865, when soldiers from areas of what now is present-day Italy were recruited by the French Army. Italians also served with the British military in Lower Canada during the War of 1812. When their regiments were disbanded in 1816, some of the soldiers stayed in Canada, settling in Ontario and in eastern townships. The first significant wave of Italian immigration began in the early 1870s until 1914. With the construction of the railroad in Canada, demand for workers was sensational. The second wave occurred between 1920 and 1930, and the greatest number of Italians to come to this country actually happened 1950 to the 1970s. Well, leaving Italy, of course, was not easy for many of them. As one Italian immigrant commented, "I know what my father loved his family, his home, and his country, and the experience of leaving it all behind must have been heartbreaking." Nonetheless, he pressed on towards the Canadian shores to give his family a new life. Those who came to Canada after World War II came from a war-torn country to build a better life for their families. There were very few jobs in Italy, so a number of families decided to make their move to Canada. Many came to Canada with just a suitcase in their hand, and that's all they had. Today, there are approximately 1.4 million Canadians of Italian descent. Of the 10,000 who live in Saskatchewan, the majority live in Saskatoon and Regina. And actually, about 3,000 make Saskatoon their home. Almost a third live in my riding of Saskatoon-Grasswood. The Italian culture is rich in tradition. We all know that. When one of my Italian constituents was asked to describe what Italians are like, she replied, "We're very resilient, hardworking, and hospitable. We love to socialize, believe in unconditional love, and family means everything to us. We're very, very proud of our culture." So what was it like for a family to leave Italy and come to Canada? Well, one member of the Saskatoon Italian community, Rosemary Pallador, shares her family's story. "My parents, along with other Italian families, immigrated to Canada and to Saskatoon in the late 50s and the early 60s. They were young, they were motivated, and they wanted a better life. They were told that Canada was a land of opportunity, a place to put down roots and raise a family. With some Italians already in Saskatoon, they were sponsored. So, on borrowed money, they chose to leave Italy and take the journey of what they would hope to be a beginning of a wonderful life." But it was a cold day back on November 22nd of 1959 when my parents arrived at Pier 21 in Halifax, after spending 2 long weeks on the ocean. To this day, my mother is still afraid of water and becomes seasick at the thought of being in a boat. My mother was 4 months pregnant with my sister, actually, at the time. Upon arrival, it did not take long for excitement to turn into anxiety and much uncertainty. And not able to speak English, no means of transportation, and of course, no jobs. The first few years were especially hard. A tight network of family and friends certainly helped my parents through the tough times. They were able to lean on this support group and to begin life where they were hoping for. Of course, the prairie winters were long and they were very cold. Italian immigrants who were new to Saskatoon were taught how they can make preserves for the winter-long months. Italians were a resourceful group, and they looked for ways to save money for their first house. Many families, though, rented a garden plot for $1 from the city of Saskatoon. That was at the corner of 33rd and Avenue P. They, of course, planted lots of tomatoes. It wasn't uncommon for the Italian gardeners back then to have 200-plus tomato plants. They made a lot of delicious tomato sauce and canned the sauce for the winter months. Many families purchased freezers that came in very handy throughout the year. So as time went on, there was an opportunity to learn English. Many Italians would go to once-a-week meetings at the Gathercole building in downtown Saskatoon to learn the English language. The majority of Italian immigrants worked in low-paying manual jobs as cleaners or construction workers. My father, like many of the men, had very little or no education, but they were very skilled tradesmen. Many were bricklayers, carpenters, stonemasons, and tile setters. In fact, my current home was built by Angie and Joe Iula of Valentino Homes in Saskatoon. It's the finest craftsmanship. We had it built by the Italian couple back in 1989. Everyone worked hard during the week, and everyone looked forward to the weekend, much as we do today. It was a time of getting together for playing cards, eating good food, and drinking homemade Italian wine. The old saying held true: work hard and certainly play hard. I'm very proud to say that many of my family members went on to become very successful entrepreneurs in the city of Saskatoon, my father included. I also grew up with many family traditions. Sundays, of course, were always family days. That began with Mass at St. Mary's Catholic Church, and then a pasta dinner shared with aunties, uncles, and cousins. Italians are a strong faith-based community. Christmas and Easter are two very important religious celebrations. Attending Mass at Christmas and Easter is the heart of these celebrations. Many Italians, and I don't have to tell you that, they love wine. Every September, the Italian men in my family would order copious amounts of grapes in crates from California. Families then would get together and set up shop in a relative's garage to make wine that would last for a year. This was a family tradition, and everyone would help take the grapes off the vines, place them into the vat where they would be crushed. As many as this was about labor-intensive for the entire day, it was also a celebration with Italian music, food, and last year's wine. Certainly a true celebration of all that life has to offer, family and good health. This tradition is still carried on today in my garage with my children, nieces, and nephews. Italian culture, as you know, is rich in tradition. Italians, through their hard work, generosity, have helped make our community a strong and vibrant and beautiful contribution. There are many famous Canadians of Italian descent. For an example, Guy Lombardo was born in London, Ontario, became the world-famous band leader. Michael Bublé is a singer, songwriter, actor, and a record producer. He was born in Burnaby, BC. He has won several awards, including 4 Grammys and multiple Junos. And of course, his Christmas albums have become a staple in many homes at the time of the year. And Megan Agosta played for the Canadian women's ice hockey team. She represented Canada in 2006, 2010, and 14 Winter Olympics. She won gold medals at all 3 and was named the most valuable player in the 2018 games. She has also played at the Women's World Championships 3 times, capturing a gold medal and 2 silvers. There is no doubt that the Italians have contributed significantly to the prosperity and the fabric of this country, and that is why I support Motion 64 here today for a designated Italian Heritage Month. Before I leave, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Rosemary Pallador, as well as many in Saskatoon, like Dominic Iula, for their contribution to this presentation. Francesca, as well as Francesca and Palawa Fortuno, and Reikina Frasetto, Anna Lawrence, and again, Dominic Iula. So thank you very much as we support Italian Heritage Month, Motion 64. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good job.
Ripresa del dibattito. Resuming debate. Reprise du débat. The honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm happy today to rise to speak in favor of motion M64, a motion recognizing June as Italian Heritage Month in Canada. But first, I have to admit some limitations in my ability to speak about Italian heritage. I grew up in a decidedly un-Italian household. My parents were quiet Anglo-Saxon Protestants. There was no wine in the house, no grappa, no garlic. And like many people, I've sent off DNA samples to learn more about my family history. I haven't got the results back yet, and I know the ads all say I'll be surprised at the results, but I can't say I will be truly surprised if the results suggest I have any amount of Italian blood in me. Now, I had my first real contact with Italian culture back in the end of 1977, early 78, when I spent a week over New Year's in Naples, staying with a Napolitano friend and his family. The exuberant meals, always accompanied by generous amounts of wine, loud talking, and wild hand gestures, were truly exciting events, even though I understood almost nothing of what was going on. And I can still taste the spaghetti fongole. About a year later, I met my future wife in Vancouver. Margaret's parents were born in the Grand Forks area of British Columbia, but her father's parents had come from Sweden, and her mother's parents, the Mazzocchis, from Italy. The Mazzocchis had come to British Columbia from a tiny village in northern Italy called Segromigno, known for the exceptional quality of its olives. The family reunions I went to with Margaret, usually held in the Mazzocchi homestead in Fife, just above Christina Lake, immediately reminded me of those meals in Naples. I really liked this family's I had good fortune to join. I learned about special Italian foods, and my favorite is the flat waffle-like cookies called pizzelle, although the Mazzocchis call it cialde. I volunteer to make a double batch of those every year at Christmas. My wife makes antipasto most years, but that is so labor-intensive, I'm happy to leave that task to her and other members of the extended family. I learned to drink a glass of wine at every meal, but I must admit I've failed at making drinkable wine myself. And I admit I haven't tried Buddy DeVito's recipe for making grappa with grape skins and raisins. I've learned how to grow good tomatoes. And I learned to play bocce, although recently I discovered that the Mazzocchis played by different rules than the rest of the world. The center of Italian culture in my riding is the city of Trail. Trail had its start as a hub for the early mining industry in the Kootenays. As mines were developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Trail smelter was built. Now owned by Teck Resources, it's one of the biggest lead-zinc smelters in the world and has been the biggest employer in the region for decades. These were well-paying jobs, and by the 1940s, Trail workers had some of the highest annual incomes in Canada. Railways were mapped out through the mountains to serve industry, agriculture, and the growing population, and laborers were needed to build them. Italian stonemasons built spectacular sections of rock walls where the rails ran along precipitous mountainsides. Immigrants came from all over the world to seek a better life in the Kootenays, but in Trail, Italians answered that call in record numbers, moving into the gulch on the west side of town. First to arrive were people from Tuscany, followed by folks from Abruzzo, Treviso, Friuli, Calabria, and today practically every dialect is represented in this city of Italians. Families with names like Fornelli, Rella, DeVito, De Rosa, Pocciola, Matucci, D'Andrea, De Biasio, Nutini, Stefani, Garafoni, Morelli, Cecchini, Santori, and so many others. Now, coincidentally, last weekend was the big Silver City Days celebration in Trail, and I had the honor and pleasure of attending many of the events. I watched the spaghetti eating contest and the grape stomp, but unfortunately I missed the bocce tournament. After the big spaghetti dinner at Colombo Lodge, John D'Arcangelo and Joe Perilla gave me a tour of the archives of that Italian cultural organization. I was deeply impressed by the rich history portrayed in the photos and artifacts on the shelves. The photos celebrated many famous Trail citizens of Italian heritage, including Thomas DeCino, president of the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, and one of the private sector architects of NAFTA. And perhaps from a slightly different part of the political spectrum, but contemporary with Mr. DeCino and also influential in the economic history of our country, we have Ken Giorgetti, former president of the Canadian Labour Congress. The arts are well represented, perhaps best illustrated by Bruno Freschi, the architect of Expo 86 in Vancouver. And hockey players. Trail has always been a centre of excellence for hockey in Canada. The Smoke Eaters won world championships in 1939 and 1961, and the Italian community has supplied numerous NHL players, including Cesar Maniago, Ray Ferraro, and Steve Tambellini. The wine industry in British Columbia, now worth billions to the Canadian economy, has to thank Italian immigrants for its early successes. Pasquale Capozzi, better known as Cap Capozzi, arrived in Canada in 1906 and worked as a railway laborer before managing the Co-op store in Trail. He opened his own store in the mining town of Phoenix, high above Greenwood in 1917, then moved to Kelowna, where he became a successful merchant. In 1932, Cap Capozzi teamed up with the Casorso family, who had been growing grapes for years in the Okanagan, to form Kelowna Wines, and by the 1960s it was the biggest winery in British Columbia. And when I was growing up in Penticton, one of our neighbors, Tony Biolo, helped found Casabella Wines, another successful early Okanagan winery. So I'm happy and proud to stand here today to support Italian Heritage Month. But we must remember that Canada has not always been welcoming to other cultures. I lived in the idyllic town of Naramata for 15 years, located just north of Penticton on Okanagan Lake. When Naramata was first settled in 1906, the developer published advertising pamphlets that were distributed in eastern Canada and Britain. Besides the beautiful setting of the town and the opportunities to grow peaches, apricots, and cherries, the leaflets also declaimed that you would not wish to find yourself surrounded with garlic-eating, foreign-speaking neighbors with whom you have nothing in common socially. The class of people coming to Naramata is not that type. They are the very best Canadian stuff. So Italians were not welcome in Naramata a century ago. But 10 years later, Italian stonemasons were working on the Kettle Valley Railway in Naramata, and their handiwork is now a point of local pride. Last weekend, I talked to a lot of people of Italian heritage and Trail. One of them told me that when he joined the RCMP in 1957, he was one of the first members of Italian heritage accepted into the force. That means 80 years of the RCMP before they started accepting Italians. My daughter Julia works in an immigrant services center in Penticton, teaching English to Syrian refugees and other immigrants. She's named after her grandmother, Julia Mazzocchi. And true to her Italian heritage, Julia works half-time in the burgeoning Okanagan wine industry. But she needs that half-time job because federal funding for immigrant services had been cut significantly. Mr. Speaker, we shouldn't cut funding for immigrant services as we properly encourage more people to move to our country. If we choose to celebrate the cultures that make up Canada, and I think, of course, that we should and must, and that's why I'm supporting this motion, we have to ensure that we provide new arrivals with the help they need, language classes, employment counseling, driver training, so that they can quickly become productive and proud citizens of our country. So, Mr. Speaker, on that note, I'd like to finish with a quote from an article in the Weekend magazine from back in 1957, an article about the Italian heritage of Trail. And this is the quote: "The man of Trail would be a prince in any country in Europe. He lives on the gold, silver, and zinc resources of Kootenays, and they will never be exhausted. As a statistical unit, he is unique. As a man working in his garden or driving his new car on a Saturday afternoon, he is strictly a product of the New World, with overtones of spaghetti and homemade wine. Even when automation comes, there will still be, it is hoped, a Seti d'Arcangelo. There will still, pray God, be a Signora Pasquale Angerelli making meatballs and spaghetti at her great black stove, and a Frank d'Arcangelo at his cask. Grazie, Mr. Speaker."
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate. The Honourable Member for Saint-Léonard Saint-Michel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to share my time with the member for Alfred Pellan. Mr. Speaker, it is with a great deal of pride. We will need unanimous consent. Do we have unanimous consent to the House to divide the time between the member for Saint-Léonard Saint-Michel And the member for Alfred Pellan? Yes, we have it.
Leonardo.
Grazie, je remercie e ringrazio tutti I colleghi qui presenti per la loro cortesia. C'est avec une immense fierté, une très vive émotion.
It is with a great deal of pride and enthusiasm that I cannot contain that I address this honorable House to give my support to motion M64 presented by my colleague, the member for Vaughan Woodbridge. Italians have been present in Canada since the very beginning of its discovery. Giovanni Cabato and Giovanni Verrazzano are among the first explorers. Then, in New France, we have Francesco Giuseppe Bressani, a Jesuit, and the Carignan-Salière Regiment. This presence never ceased to grow over the following decades and centuries. Italians have made their mark on Canada since the very beginning. Italians who came to Canada brought with them a most precious treasure, 5,000 years of civilization. Indeed, despite their state of poverty caused by the tumultuous times in their motherland, Italians brought with them soul, heart, mind, and body. A fascinating treasure which benefited all of Canada and every area they were able to flourish. Mr. Speaker, without a doubt, Canada would not be what it is now without the extraordinary contribution of the Italians who came to settle here. Of all the generations that arrived, I am particularly aware of the post-war generation that started to arrive in 1949. My father, Giovanna Di Orio,
De Casagalenda, province.
de Casagalenda, Provincia di Campobasso, was one of them. My mother, Giuseppe Renalucci de Lorino, arrived in 1955. She was also part of that wave. This generation breathed new life into institutions that had been founded by the generation that came at the beginning of the 20th century and between both wars, and created new ones. This generation completely transformed the face of Montreal, which is now celebrating this very week its 375th anniversary of its foundation. Italians of this generation made enormous personal sacrifices through very hard work and deprivation in order to allow their family to live a better life. In Quebec, religious affinity was evident when it was time to send children to school because of the issue of internment. During the Second World War, the government of our country arrested and detained men, Canadian citizens, or who were becoming citizens, without charges, without any valid reason, and without being able to get justice before the courts. At the time, it was impossible to question government decisions because it granted an aura of legitimacy to that act and stigmatized Italians in Canada who sometimes feel that today, sometimes openly, but often in a most inappropriate and subtle way. Despite these prejudices, newcomers went to work immediately in order to create their lives and to make a colossal contribution to building the Quebec that we know today. They revitalized Italian churches that had been founded at the beginning of the 20th century, Madonna del Carmine and Madonna della Difesa, without forgetting the others that were founded afterwards. They created businesses, community organizations, cultural organizations, and charitable organizations, as well as schools, hospitals. They even built cities. The riding of Saint-Léonard, Saint-Michel, which I represent here with so much pride, is made up of two cities who carry those names. In just 15 years, from 1955 to 1970, their population grew by 50 times because of the hard work of these post-war Italians. Casa d'Italia is the oldest ethnic cultural center in Canada. Centro Leonardo da Vinci, which I founded with Giuseppe Borsellino and Silvio De Rose, are a cradle of Quebec's Italian community. The Quebec's Italian-Canadian Community Foundation supports hundreds of charitable organizations in our community. To that, we add a great number of associations that represent cities and villages of origin, as well as all of the federazione. Entities created by Italians are so numerous that we cannot possibly describe them all in such a short time. I would like to acknowledge my colleagues from La Salle, Aymar Verdun, and Alfred Pellan, whose work contributes to our community's ability to flourish. We all have a duty to remember so that Canada's history is told without ever forgetting the rich and exceptional contribution of Italians, which deserves to be recognized in its full and fair value. Viva Italia! Viva Canada!
Reprise du débat, l'honorable.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Alfred Pellan.
Buongiorno a tutti I miei colleghi qui oggi. First, I would like to thank my colleague, the member from King Wong, for putting forward this motion. The recognition of the Italian community and heritage in Canada is dear to my heart as a Canadian Italian. And I am grateful for her dedicated work on this motion. Motion M64 will allow the 1.5 million Italian Canadians to celebrate every June the deep and rich heritage of their roots. Not that Italians really need a reason to throw a party, but here's a good one to celebrate now. The Italian community in Canada will now be celebrated all over the country, and their history will be put forward so that all Canadians from every origin can recognize the great contributions made by the community. Lorsque les Italiens ont commencé à...
When Italians started to emigrate to Canada, especially at the beginning of the 20th century, they often had to face a harsh reality and difficult conditions. But thanks to their determination, to their great sense of family, to their sense of community, and to their work ethic, they not only overcame those challenges, but they also were able to become prosperous entrepreneurs, community leaders, and they contributed to building the Canada that we know today. I am grateful to them.
Discussed today recognizes not only the contributions that Italian Canadians have made to Canadian society, but also the richness of the Italian language and culture, and the importance of educating and reflecting upon Italian heritage for future generations, just like I try to do with my son Gabriel, who enjoys gardening, eating pasta with meatballs and lots of homemade tomato sauce, and you know what? Even a bit of little homemade wine. He never says no. I feel it's really important for him to remain connected with his roots, to know the history of his grandparents and how they came to Canada and worked hard so that the generations to follow could have a better quality of life. I will always be thankful to my parents and all the Italian immigrants of their generation for immigrating to this wonderful country I can call my own now, and for paving the way for me, fellow Canadians, Italians of my generation and all future generations, so that we become responsible citizens, conscious of the greatness of Canada and respectful of the opportunities we have due to their sacrifices. It is those sacrifices that allowed me to be today a member of Parliament to represent a great riding and city, Alfred Pellat in Laval. J'aimerais d'ailleurs prendre
I would like to take a moment to recognize my fellow Italian citizens in Alfred Pellat, Laval, and Montreal. Together, you create a rich, vibrant, involved, and important community in the heart of our beautiful region.
to be able to stand here in the House of Commons to represent your interests, and so proud to be able to vote in favor of this motion in your name. Grazie mamma, grazie papà per tutto quello che avete fatto. Un grande abbraccio a voi due e grazie signor Presidente.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Hamilton West, Ancaster Dundas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to ask that to split my time with the member from Humber River, Black Creek. Buongiorno a tutti. I am so proud and honored to rise today to speak on
I'm sorry, I'll have to interrupt you for a moment. Do we have unanimous consent to divide the 10-minute period into two 5-minute periods so that you can split her time with the honourable member for Humber River, Black Creek? We have that consent. My apologies. Please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to all my colleagues in this House. I am so proud and honored to rise today to speak on Motion 64 that recognizes the month of June as Italian Heritage Month. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, it's nice to see you in the chair this morning for this debate. Growing up in an Italian household, a Marchegiano and Abruzzese household, was absolutely amazing. My parents and my grandparents embodied that robust Italian culture and values. They passed these values and lessons down to me and my siblings. Growing up in an Italian household taught me the true sense of the words hospitality and love. The doors to my parents' home were always open to whomever wanted to visit, and strangers and family were treated equally. There was always a meal waiting and ready, and there was always acceptance and love to be shared. In fact, my Nonna set up a permanent table on her back porch, which she decorated with a beautiful tablecloth. And she'd have the sugo on the stove, always ready, and ready to boil that pot of water for a stranger or a family member to come by to share a meal. It was her pride and joy. She took great love and joy in those times. Family is an integral part to the Italian culture. The love for children, grandchildren, and all family members is absolutely incredible. My parents dedicated their lives to ensuring that I had the best possible upbringing. They sacrificed and worked tirelessly to provide me and my siblings with what we needed to flourish. Whether it was my father balancing shift work to make sure I and my teammates got to the games on time, or setting aside time to coach, or helping put me through school, Mr. Speaker, the list goes on and on. But above and beyond all of that, the most important thing to me was the love that my parents showed me, my siblings, my children, and all their grandchildren. The love that is healing, that is encouraging, that is energizing, that is rejuvenating, the love that is the key to success. My parents, the love they showed me, Mr. Speaker, made me feel that I could attain any dream I wanted to. I had their support, I had their confidence, I knew that I could do it. This is a true gift to be treasured. It was my Italian family that I learned kind and caring and generous faith. It was from them that my liberal, progressive Catholicism grew, an acceptance of warm religion, of forgiveness and second chances. It was beautiful then, and those values continue to guide my life today. Mr. Speaker, I cannot talk about this topic without talking about work ethic. Italians have had a very large hand in building Hamilton, whether it was working hard in the steel mills, in construction, hospitality, or now in high-tech businesses, manufacturing, and professions. Hamilton's Italian community is a model of integration, contribution, and leadership. One need only look at McMaster University in Mohawk, where Italian Canadians have made their mark as professors, researchers, and senior administrators. In my own life, my parents worked very hard. My father was a proud steelworker, my mother the secretary in a high school or an elementary school, as well as an assistant to a former cabinet minister. And they demonstrated that we have to take pride in our work and put our best foot forward. I recall the story of my father who was driving my nono to work. My nono was coughing. My father turned the car around. And my nono says, "Filippo, what are you doing?" And my father says, "Dad, if I take you to work, you're going to die." He says, "Filippo, you turn the car around. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die on the job." Now, Mr. Speaker, I know this raises eyebrows today, but it is a demonstration of that amazing work ethic on which we stand and we take great pride. Hamilton has had a mayor of Italian origin, many councillors and MPs. We have Festa Italia, which has created Opera Hamilton. We have Sons of Italy, who are doing amazing work. We have this fabric of the Italian experience woven into our city. And we look forward to many great ongoing events that the Italians celebrate in Hamilton and makes it richer. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I wish to express the gratitude of the people of Italian descent to this country, Canada. We've heard our Prime Minister say repeatedly, we are stronger because of our diversity. There have been injustices towards our community, but that has not taken away from the gratitude and appreciation of our country. My grandmother said it best when she said, "The bread on our tables has been put here by Canadians." In turn, Canada has benefited tremendously from our Italian culture. I'm so proud and happy to support this motion, which establishes June as the Italian Heritage Month. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate e ripresa del dibattito, the honourable member for Humber River, Black Creek.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I have to tell you, listening to my colleagues, it's truly a joy and an honour to be able to stand today and to speak on behalf of the 1.4 million Canadians who claim Italian ancestry. And of course, this includes more than 15,000 in my own riding and of course my own family. Before I do this, I want to take a moment and thank the member for Kingbon for carrying forward this motion on behalf of all of us in the House, and specifically on behalf, of course, of our Italian-Canadian Parliamentary Caucus, which we're very proud of. Of course, you've heard about how the first Italian was Giovanni Caboto in 1497, and you've heard as well about the contingent of Italians that came after World War II and in the 18th century. It was in this period, during our country's infancy, that saw the emergence of the first Italian-Canadian communities and eventually the first sense of an Italian-Canadian identity within Canada's cultural mosaic. Put another way, Italians have been coming to Canada for as long as there has been a Canada to come to, helping to build and shape our country into the society that we all enjoy today. M64 would establish June as Italian Heritage Month, and by doing this, it recognizes the contributions of the many Italian Canadians to our society and to our culture are significant. And as evidenced by efforts such as Marino Topan and his work on the Italian Fallen Workers Monument that was recently erected in Toronto with the names of thousands of Italian Canadians who lost their lives on construction sites, in mining accidents, and so on. Clearly, the Italian Canadians were not passive witness to the country's development. M64 acknowledges and validates the hard work and the sacrifices made by all of those who left the familiarity and security of their homeland to come and build a new home here. An example of just a few of the very successful Italian Canadians is Franco Iacobucci. To his name, he was the first Italian Canadian named to the Supreme Court. And then we had our first Canadian Italian senator with Peter Bosa. And our first Italian minister in the federal government was Charles Caccia. And the first alderman on North York City Council was my mentor, Paul Valenti. These are just examples of the success of some of the great Italian Canadians that we have here, and just a few of those that I know personally in the GTA. Clearly, throughout our country, there is not an area that does not have a shining star in the community that isn't of Italian origin. Last week, I had the great pleasure to attend an important fundraiser to raise money for the earthquake victims in Italy from the earthquake last year. Sergio Marchioni was there, another Italian-Canadian that was there, and was very pleased to be there to help raise the money. Also, people like Joe Montanaro of Dolcini's in my riding, or Danny Montesano of Lido Construction, who has transformed his own business in an endless struggle to make Canada better. And then there's Sam Premucci, founder of Pizza Nova, Angelo Lucento of Vinbone Wineries, Tony Veroni, owner of Monte Cassino, Johnny Lombardi's Chin radio station that was created, which is run now by Lenny and the rest of the family. Marco Muzzo, Alvio Del Zotto, Rudy Bratti are all just some examples of Italian Canadians that have helped to build this great country, both spiritually and morally and physically, with buildings throughout our country that were all put there as a result of the work that they have done. My own husband, Sam Scrow, who came to this country with empty pockets and big dreams, and successfully grew a business, provided for a family, and worked each day to prove that nothing was impossible, except as long as you had hard work there. So the Italian-Canadian history and culture are part of the story of Canada, and M64 formalizes that. It has the endorsement of the Canadian Ethnic Cultural Council and its president, Dominic Campioni, as an example of all of the different organizations throughout Canada that have worked within the Italian community and have a tremendous amount of respect for that. So I support M64. I'm thrilled that our caucus is united behind it. I look forward to the vote coming up, I hope, on Wednesday, and it'll truly start to be a magnificent month of joy and love throughout the month of June. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation.
Camera storica istruita per dare il mio appoggio a questo progetto. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to rise today in this chamber, a historic place, to give my support to this motion put forth by the member for King Vaughan, with the support of all members of the Italian-Canadian caucus in Parliament. As the son of an Italian family and as a member of Parliament, I'm very proud that this motion has been tabled before this House precisely to underscore the important contribution of Italian Canadians to our country throughout our history, a history that was well described by my colleague from Saint-Michel, Saint-Léonard, with a great deal of pride and passion. And I want to highlight the cooperation I get from my colleagues from Quebec, the member for Alfred Pellan and the member for Saint-Michel, Saint-Léonard. It's a pleasure to work with them. Over the years, Mr. Speaker, the Italian community, made up of many different waves of immigrants, changed the face of our country. And with this motion, we're taking a first step to recognize that historic fact. Of course, there will be other measures that need to be taken, especially correcting the history of the internment of Italian Canadians, and that's a second step that this House should undertake in the future.
in Canada, Mr. Speaker, can't be reduced to cliches, but should be reduced to the very real contributions that Italian Canadians have made in a wide variety of places. I'll speak to the experience of my family, Mr. Speaker. My father came from the province of the Marches in 1951 as a skilled laborer, a carpenter. He worked in a factory context for much of his life, but then branched out, left the factory, branched out on his own to found his own construction company in Port Colborne, Ontario. My fondest memories as a child, Mr. Speaker, were tagging along with my father and hanging around on construction sites and learning how to use a hammer and a saw, skills that I still have today, Mr. Speaker. My mother, after my father's early death, became well known in the Niagara Peninsula as a caterer at a number of the different Italian-Canadian clubs and halls that were so important, still are so important to the Italian-Canadian culture. And I would like to underline, there are a number of historic Italian-Canadians, but I would like to underline one who has been a mentor to me, the Honourable Justice Frank Iacobucci. Because in a number of different contexts, Frank was a groundbreaking Italian-Canadian. First of all, as an academic at the University of Toronto, in law, again, a subject area. There are many Italian-Canadian lawyers, but really Justice Iacobucci was the first great Italian-Canadian academic, legal academic. He then went on, Mr. Speaker, to become a university administrator at the University of Toronto, then a Deputy Minister of Justice for this government at the federal level under Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, and then became the first Italian-Canadian to be the Chief Justice of the Federal Court of Canada, as well as the first Italian-Canadian named to the Supreme Court. And this pathway, Mr. Speaker, was groundbreaking for Italian-Canadians, and Justice Iacobucci served as a model to many of us moving through Canadian society. Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to represent the riding of LaSalle-Imard-Verdun in Montreal, which has a large population of Italian-Canadians, many of whom from my region of Italy, the Marches, but also from Sicily and Calabria and other parts of Italy as well. And I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, that it is a vibrant community with a number of different organizations, a number of different events, and they are very proud of their Italian heritage and their Italian traditions, as I see every time someone offers me a glass of homemade wine, Mr. Speaker. I would also like to point out that in the city of my birth, Port Colborne, Ontario, there is a large Italian-Canadian population in the Niagara Peninsula, as the member from Niagara Falls will attest, as the member from Niagara Centre will attest, and the member from St. Catharines. And these two are vibrant populations that continue to thrive and promote the Italian heritage in Canada. We should speak about values, Mr. Speaker, the values that Italian Canadians brought. They brought faith, Mr. Speaker, a progressive faith. They brought the value of family and reinforced that, continue to reinforce that in their daily lives. Of course, there's food, Mr. Speaker, and I like to joke by saying I never knew that most Canadian kids didn't eat pasta every day until I went to school and saw what other kids were eating. I'm proud of that, Mr. Speaker, as I'm proud of the many recipes that my mother brought. I'm proud of the language that I have passed on to my children. But I would also like to move beyond those and say there were values of intellect and ingenuity that came with Italian-Canadian immigrants. It is a vibrant, intelligent culture that applied their knowledge in a variety of different sectors in Canada, as well as business acumen and know-how in order to help grow the Canadian economy. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to point out that it is the future that this motion points us towards. We need to be thinking about continued collaboration with Italy. Italy has an excellent record in terms of its universities and its innovative sectors. Mr. Speaker, I had the good fortune as a legal academic to be a fairly common lecturer and professor in a number of Italian universities over the course of my academic career, with particular ties to the universities in Trento, Perugia, Torino, and Rome. And here I was witness firsthand to the ongoing collaboration between Canadian and Italian academics and scientists and lawyers, etc. And it is these innovative collaborations that will help us develop a variety of different sectors that we deem important in our economy moving forward in this century, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my parents worked exceedingly hard. They made a number of sacrifices for their children. We in this House know how hard we work as MPs, Mr. Speaker. I know how hard I work as an MP, Mr. Speaker. But let me tell you, frankly, that I don't work half as hard as my parents did. And for that example, Mr. Speaker, for the example that many of the those of us in this House who had Italian-Canadian parents, or still fortunate enough to have Italian-Canadian parents, that example is critically important to the way we orient our lives, to the service that we give to our family, to our faith, to our community, and to our country. And for that reason, Mr. Speaker, I am so proud to support this motion brought forward today. Thank you.
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate.
L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Lac Saint-Louis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was wondering if there was any time left for me to speak for a few minutes. You have 4 minutes. Please proceed. I'll try to say everything I need to say in 4 minutes. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I'd like to congratulate the member for Vaughan for this initiative. She worked extremely hard for this motion to be tabled so we can get to this point and take part in an interesting and vigorous debate on the issue of creating a month for Italian heritage. It's a very proud moment for me to be able to rise as a Canadian, a Montrealer of Italian origin. What we're marking today is not just the contribution of the Italian community to the culture of this big country we call Canada. We're also marking the work of thousands and millions of immigrants from Italy who built Canada.
We are, as I just said in the other official language, we are celebrating all that the Italian community has brought culturally to Canada as something that we see every day in the restaurants and the festivals and in all kinds of links through fashion and sports cars to Italy. But we're also commemorating and honoring and celebrating the hard work of thousands and millions of Italian Canadians who built this country in different ways, in small ways, sometimes in big ways. In my own case, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take a moment to pay homage to my grandfather, Francesco Scarpaleggia, who came from Italy with very little education, came in through Ellis Island, which many people did at the time, and wound his way up to Montreal, where he was a downtown Montreal barber for many, many years. I even have a photo of myself as a young child sitting in his barber's chair. He died in 1968, so I was very young at the time. But I'm very proud of what he brought to Montreal in a small but very dignified way. And you know, he had a son, my father, who you know, went on to be educated and then to take on more responsible positions within Montreal society. And so I'd like to pay homage to them and also to the many Italians of my riding of Lac Saint-Louis. We have a very vibrant Italian community. We have the West Island Italian Association headed by Mr. Egidio Vincelli. We have the St. Anthony's Seniors Club headed by Maria Gervasi. We have, of course, the tireless Jack Ciampini, who makes sure that everyone is well taken care of in the Italian community, that he looks after them and makes sure that they have the ability to participate in many, many activities at the community level. So thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this brief time to address the House on this important motion.
All right, to reply, the honourable member for King Vaughan.
Mr. Speaker, it is truly a privilege to rise today to again acknowledge the importance of the Italian-Canadian community in Canada and to thank all those that have participated in the debate on my motion to designate June as a National Italian Heritage Month. I'd like to especially thank all my colleagues on the Liberal Italian Caucus, many of them having a chance to speak today to tell their very important stories during this debate. I would also like to acknowledge you, the Deputy Speaker, representing Nipissing-Temiskaming, and for being also part of today. Very special day. It was nice to see all the speeches in support of the motion. This broad support speaks to the importance of the Italian-Canadian community all across Canada. We've heard speeches that have mentioned the early explorers from Italy that helped to discover Canada, and then heard about those that came to do battle here, first with the French and then the British, and stayed. We've heard about the craftsmen, the artists, the musicians, and the teachers that came in the 19th century, then the builders that helped to build our railways and our cities, and the farmers in the Niagara Peninsula and the Okanagan Valley that helped create the orchards, the vineyards, and the vegetable farms. We've also heard that it was not easy for many Italians who came to start a new life here, especially after 1935, when Italian Canadians were designated enemy aliens because Italy allied with Germany during the Second World War. Men lost their jobs, shops were vandalized, civil liberties suspended, and hundreds were interned at Camp Petawawa in Northern Ontario. Many suffered. However, after the Second World War, with the Canadian economy booming, Canada began again to be receptive to Italians. Italians brought with them a rich cultural heritage, a dedication to family, and a strong work ethic that helped many to succeed. In cities where they settled, they tended to create ethnic neighborhoods, little Italies where their distinctive shops, restaurants, churches, and clubs were a magnet for other Canadians wanting to get a taste of Italy. Italian Canadians have contributed greatly over the past century to growing this country. They've become community leaders, successful business entrepreneurs, and well-known artists. We've heard many of them mentioned today in the debate. I can think of many successful, well-known Italian Canadians, including some from my own community. The mayor of Vaughan, Maurizio Bevilacqua, who came to Canada as a young boy with his family from Sulmona, Italy, with very little. He became an MP at age of 28 and served until becoming mayor of Vaughan in 2010. For Italians, family, religion, and their close connection to their cultural history are at the core of their identity and a source of strength and pride. I live in a riding with the second highest percentage of Italians, and I'm very proud of their hard work and their contributions. They've helped Vaughan grow into a very desirable community that it is today. Italian Canadians have the highest rate of home ownership, reflecting the importance of family and home as its center. They are also exceptionally generous when it comes to those in need, building seniors facilities, donating to hospitals, and supporting many causes, helping not just Italian Canadians, but all Canadians. We have many active Italian senior groups that work hard to keep seniors engaged and supported. And if you look at our community organizations, you'll see many of those same seniors on the boards and volunteering. The Italian Canadian press and media have also been strong promoters of social cohesion and have brought their Italian constituency and the wider society together through the decades. Today we have the Corriere Canadese and several other Italian community newspapers. We have Omni TV and the Teletino Network and National Cable System that promote Italian culture and news. Italian and Chinese are the most widespread non-official languages in Canada, in Canadian television and radio broadcasting. Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to bring forward this motion, and I'm honoured to have the support of the Liberal Italian Caucus, many of them here today with me. I want to thank all of those that have spoken during the debate and for all the support received from both sides of the House. I also want to acknowledge the strong support from the National Congress of Italian Canadians, the National Federation of Canadian Italian Business and Professional Associations, the Order Sons of Italy of Canada, and the Canadian Ethnocultural Council. We look forward to June, where we will celebrate across this great country the contributions and accomplishments of Italian Canadians. On June the 2nd, Italian Canadians will celebrate Festa della Repubblica, Republic Day, which is the Italian National Day. And on June the 6th, the Canada-Italy Friendship Group will have our second Italian Day on the Hill, which will be a wonderful celebration of the Italian culture and heritage right here on Parliament Hill. Thank you again to all those that have supported me in bringing forward this motion. Merci, grazie.
Comme il est 12